My parent died, and my brother evicted me 4 days later. He didn't know I had a hidden camera. The red and blue lights of the Gallatin County Sheriff's cruiser cut through the heavy Montana snowfall, painting the side of my family's century-old barn in harsh, unnatural colors. It was 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday. I stood on the porch, my breath pluming in the freezing air, holding a mug of black coffee that had long gone cold. Deputy Miller, a man I had played high school football with, stepped out of the cruiser. He didn't look me in the eye as he walked up the wooden steps. His boots crunched on the fresh snow, sounding entirely too loud in the dead quiet of the valley. He handed me a manila envelope. Inside was a temporary restraining order and a notice of immediate eviction. The plaintiff was my older brother, Richard. "I'm sorry, David," Miller said, his voice tight with genuine discomfort. "The judge signed it an hour ago. Richard's lawyer claimed you made violent threats against him and that you're illegally squatting on his property. I have to ask you to pack a bag. You have 20 minutes." I didn't yell. I didn't throw a punch. 10 years in the Army as a logistics officer had trained the panic out of me. Instead, I looked down at the documents in my hands. The paperwork claimed that Richard was the sole legal owner of the 400-acre farm, citing a deed transfer executed via a power of attorney just 3 weeks before our mother's death. She had been in the ground for exactly 4 days. I folded the papers, walked inside, packed a single duffel bag, and left the home I had bled for. That was how my brother thanked me for 5 years of hell. When Dad died, Richard was already living in a glass-walled condo in Chicago, working as a senior VP for an investment firm. He didn't come back for the funeral. He said the markets were too volatile to step away. A year later, Mom was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's. I didn't hesitate. I resigned my commission, packed up my life, and moved back to Bozeman. If you've never cared for someone with dementia, you don't know what true exhaustion is. It's not just physical fatigue. It's a soul-crushing erosion of the person you love. It's locking the doors from the inside so she doesn't wander into the snow at 3:00 a.m. It's washing soiled bedsheets twice a day. It's looking into your mother's eyes and seeing absolutely nothing but blank terror because she thinks you're a stranger trying to kidnap her. For 5 years, I was her nurse, her cook, her janitor, and her warden. In all that time, Richard never visited. Not once. He sent a generic floral arrangement on her birthdays and a text message on Thanksgiving. He claimed he couldn't bear to see her like that. Mom passed away quietly in her sleep on a Thursday morning in November. I called Richard. He arrived on a red-eye flight the next day, wearing a tailored Italian suit that cost more than my truck. At the funeral, he wept openly, accepting condolences from the locals, playing the part of the devastated, loving son. I stood in the back, too hollowed out to cry. I thought his performance was just vanity. I didn't realize it was the opening act of a robbery. The morning after the funeral, I found a real estate appraiser walking the fence line of the lower pasture. When I confronted him, he showed me an email from Richard. My brother was selling the farm to a commercial developer out of Denver who wanted to turn our family's legacy into a luxury eco-resort. The agreed price was $1.8 million. When I stormed into the kitchen to confront Richard, he was already sitting at the oak table, his slick Chicago lawyer beside him. That was when he slid the copies of the deed across the table. "It's done, David," Richard had said, not even looking up from his phone. "Mom gave me general power of attorney last month. I transferred the property into an LLC to protect the estate from probate taxes. It's strictly business. I'll cut you a check for 50 grand to help you get on your feet somewhere else, but the farm is being sold." I knew it was a lie. A month ago, Mom couldn't even remember how to hold a spoon, let alone understand complex estate law. She hadn't known her own name for over a year. But Richard had brought a mobile notary up from Wyoming, someone who didn't know her condition, to stamp the documents. When I told him I was going to fight him in court, that I would testify to her mental incompetence, his lawyer simply smiled. By midnight, Deputy Miller was at my door with a restraining order, claiming I was an armed, disgruntled veteran making terroristic threats against the rightful owner. I spent my first night off the farm at a roadside motel on the edge of town. The heater rattled like a dying engine, and the room smelled of stale smoke and bleach. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring at the wall, feeling a profound, suffocating sense of defeat. I went to see a local probate attorney the next morning. His name was Tom Garrison, an old-school lawyer with a messy desk and a sharp mind. He looked over the eviction notice and the copy of the deed I had managed to photograph. "David, I believe you," Tom said, taking off his glasses and rubbing his eyes. "But in the eyes of the law, a notarized power of attorney is a titanium shield. To overturn this, we have to prove lack of capacity or undue influence at the exact moment she signed it. That is incredibly difficult to do after the principal is deceased. Medical records showing dementia are good. But Richard's lawyer will argue she had a moment of lucidity. Unless you have a witness who was in the room when she signed it, it's your word against a notarized legal document." I drove back to the motel, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Richard had timed it perfectly. He had waited until Mom was dead to execute his plan, ensuring the only person who could dispute the power of attorney was no longer breathing. He was going to take the farm. He was going to pave over the soil our grandfather had cleared by hand. I opened my duffel bag to get a change of clothes, and my hand brushed against a small, black external hard drive. I froze. 3 years ago, the stress of caregiving had pushed me to the edge of a breakdown. The VA assigned me a counselor. She suggested I keep a journal, but by the time I got Mom to bed, I was too exhausted to write. Instead, the counselor suggested a video journal. I set up a small, discreet digital camera on the bookshelf in the living room. It was motion activated. I used it to record my thoughts, but it also recorded the daily struggles, Mom's severe episodes, her wandering, the reality of her decline. I had handed the footage over to her neurologist to help adjust her medications. I hadn't looked at the drive in months. I pulled out my laptop, plugged in the drive, and sorted the video files by date. I went back to exactly 3 weeks before Mom died. It was a Tuesday. I remembered that day clearly because I had driven into town to pick up her refill of Seroquel and buy groceries. I had been gone for exactly 3 hours. I clicked on the file timestamped 2:14 p.m. The video opened with the living room bathed in pale afternoon light. Mom was sitting in her recliner, staring blankly at the television, which wasn't turned on. Then, the front door opened. Richard walked in. He was followed by a woman carrying a briefcase, the notary. I watched, my heart pounding in my throat, as the scene unfolded. Richard knelt in front of Mom. He didn't ask how she was. He didn't hug her. "Mom," Richard said, his voice dripping with a sickening, manufactured sweetness. "It's me. It's Arthur." Arthur was our father's name. Mom's face twisted in confusion, and then a fragile, desperate smile broke across her face. "Artie, you came back from the mill?" "Yeah, honey, I'm back," Richard lied without missing a beat, weaponizing her dementia against her. "Listen, the bank needs you to sign some papers for the house. It's just routine. You trust me, right?" "Of course, Artie," she whispered, her hands shaking violently. The notary looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. Richard placed the power of attorney on the coffee table, wrapped his hand over Mom's frail, trembling fingers, and literally guided the pen across the signature line. She didn't even look at the paper. She was just staring at the man she thought was her dead husband. 10 minutes later, Richard and the notary left. My mother went back to staring at the blank television. I sat in the motel room, the silence deafening, a cold, absolute rage settling into my bones. Richard hadn't just stolen the farm. He had violated the sanctuary of her broken mind. I didn't stop there. The video gave me the date and time. I logged into Mom's online banking portal, which I had managed for 5 years to pay her medical bills. I looked at the history. On that exact same day, 3 hours after he secured the fraudulent power of attorney, Richard had walked into a local branch and authorized a wire transfer. He didn't just take the farm. He had drained her entire 401k retirement account for $100,000. I spent the next 4 hours doing amateur forensic accounting, tracing the routing numbers. The money hadn't gone into an estate account. It had gone to a private holding firm in Chicago. A quick search of public court records in Cook County revealed the truth. Richard was being sued by his own investment firm for unauthorized options trading. He was in debt for $500,000. The farm sale wasn't about a business opportunity. It was a desperate attempt to stay out of federal prison. The next morning, I didn't go to the farm. I went straight to Tom Garrison's office. I didn't say a word. I just opened my laptop and pressed play. Tom watched the video twice. The first time, his expression was professional. The second time, his jaw tightened, and a hard, dangerous light flickered in his eyes. When I showed him the wire transfer records, he stood up, grabbed his coat, and looked at me. "David," Tom said, his voice deadly calm. "We're going to the courthouse. We're filing an emergency injunction to halt the sale of the property. And then, I'm calling a buddy of mine at the FBI field office in Helena, because what your brother just did isn't a civil dispute. It's felony wire fraud and aggravated elder abuse." The probate hearing was scheduled 3 days later. Richard walked into the courtroom looking like he owned the building. His lawyer carried a thick leather briefcase and wore a smug, condescending smile. They sat on the plaintiff's side, completely relaxed. Richard didn't even look at me. He was busy checking his designer watch. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s named Harrison, called the court to order. Richard's lawyer stood up immediately, launching into a rehearsed speech about legal precedents, the sanctity of a notarized document, and my alleged instability. "Your Honor, my client is simply executing the legal wishes of his late mother," the lawyer proclaimed. "The defendant is a disgruntled, unemployed individual trying to extort money from a grieving son." Judge Harrison turned to my table. "Mr. Garrison, do you have a response?" Tom stood up slowly. "We do, Your Honor. The defense contends that the power of attorney is entirely fraudulent, obtained through coercion, undue influence, and impersonation. Furthermore, we submit that the document was used to facilitate federal wire fraud. We have submitted Exhibit A for the court's immediate review." The bailiff handed the judge a tablet. I watched Richard's face as the audio from the video filled the quiet courtroom. "Mom, it's me. It's Arthur." Richard's smug posture shattered. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. His lawyer leaned over, frantically whispering to him, but Richard was paralyzed. His eyes locked on the tablet in the judge's hands. "You trust me, right?" "Of course, Artie." When the video finished, the courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the overhead lights. Judge Harrison set the tablet down face down. She looked at Richard, and the absolute disgust in her eyes was palpable. "Mr. Scott," the judge said, her voice dropping an octave. "In my 20 years on the bench, I have rarely seen something so profoundly repulsive. She didn't just grant our injunction to halt the sale. She immediately revoked the power of attorney, invalidated the deed transfer, and voided the restraining order against me. But that was only the civil side. As we walked out of the courtroom, 2 federal agents were waiting in the hallway. Richard's lawyer tried to intervene, but it was useless. They placed my brother in handcuffs right there on the marble floor, reading him his rights for federal wire fraud and elder exploitation. Richard finally looked at me as they marched him toward the elevator. There was no arrogance left, just the panicked, wide-eyed stare of a man who realized his entire life had just burned to the ground. I didn't say anything. I just turned and walked away. 2 weeks later, the snow began to melt in the valley. I stood on the porch of the farmhouse, watching the morning sun break over the Bridger Mountains. The title of the farm was back in a trust, legally secured. The $400,000 had been frozen by the feds and was in the process of being returned to the estate. Richard was sitting in a federal holding cell, denied bail because he was deemed a flight risk. His firm had fired him, and his assets were frozen. I took a sip of my coffee. It was hot this time. The house behind me was empty, the silence heavy but no longer oppressive. I had spent 5 years watching my mother lose her mind, but in the end, she had inadvertently provided the key to saving the only thing our family had left. Setting a trap doesn't always require malice. Sometimes, all it requires is the truth. And my brother had simply forgotten that the truth, when recorded, is the only thing a liar cannot outrun.